She gave medicine to a dying Apache. The next morning, 100 warriors descended the hill. The leather pouch fell from trembling fingers, sacred stones scattering across blood-stained snow like fallen stars. Astrid's breath caught in her throat as she stared down at the impossible sight before her. A warrior who shouldn't exist. Not here. Not in these frozen Danish borderlands, where Christian bells warred with pagan drums. His copper skin bore intricate tattoos that seemed to writhe in the flickering torchlight. Symbols she'd never seen, yet somehow recognized in the deepest corners of her exiled soul. The Apache's fevered whispers echoed in a tongue that predated her Norse ancestors, predated even the Saxon settlements beyond the next ridge. But it was his eyes that sealed her fate, dark as winter nights, yet burning with the same desperate fire she'd carried since her own people cast her out for daring to heal with both Christian prayer and ancient runes. How had he traveled thousands of impossible miles? What sacred quest had brought him to die in her cursed refuge? The wind howled like Odin's ravens as Astrid knelt beside the dying stranger, her healer's instincts screaming louder than every survival instinct that had kept her alive through 3 brutal winters of exile. Antes de continuarmos con esa historia incrível, preciso te fazer uma alerta importante. Muitos inscritos têm relatado que o YouTube removeu suas inscrições sem aviso. Dá só uma conferida rápida no botão vermelho aí embaixo para garantir que você ainda está inscrito no canal. Não quero que você perca nenhum conteúdo exclusivo que vem por aí. E já que você está aí, deixa aquele like poderoso que me ajuda muito com o algoritmo. Me conta nos comentários. De qual cidade você está assistindo? Adoro conhecer cada pessoa incrível que faz parte dessa comunidade. Sua participação faz toda a diferença. Vamos interagir. The blizzard of 847 AD struck the borderlands with the fury of Thor's hammer, turning the world into a white wasteland where even wolves feared to hunt. Astrid's small shelter, little more than stacked stones and stolen timber, groaned under the weight of ice and wind that cut through flesh like Saxon steel. She should have left him to die. Both Danes and Saxons would demand it. A Christian woman harboring an unknown warrior? The accusations alone would see her burned as a witch, or worse. But as the Apache's fever spiked through the night, something deeper than fear or faith compelled her hands to move. The scent of burning peat filled her nostrils as she worked, mixing herbs by firelight while the storm raged outside. His skin burned like forge-heated metal beneath her touch, yet he shivered as if touched by hell's icy breath. She'd seen battle fever before, had watched berserkers die from wounds that should have been mere scratches. This was different, ancient, sacred. Your gods and mine, she whispered in the old tongue, then caught herself. Years of exile hadn't broken her habit of speaking to the spirits her Christian conversion was supposed to have silenced. "Forgive me, Lord," she added in Latin, then wondered if any god was listening to a healer caught between worlds. Throughout the endless night, she fought for his life. Cool water on burning skin, willow bark tea forced between cracked lips, prayers in 3 languages, while his sacred stones seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat in the firelight. When dawn finally broke, painting the snow-covered hills in shades of blood and gold, Astrid had won. The Apache's fever had broken. His breathing came steady and deep. That's when she heard it. A rumble like avalanche thunder, like the earth itself splitting open. She stepped outside her shelter, squinting against the bright morning snow, and felt her heart stop. The western hill erupted with movement. Horses, warriors, 100 mounted Apache riders in full war formation, their feathered lances catching the early light like a forest of deadly flowers. They moved with supernatural precision, as if they'd materialized from the spirit world itself. At their head rode a chief whose war paint seemed to burn with its own fire, his eyes locked directly on Astrid's humble shelter. Behind him, painted warriors notched arrows to bowstrings, their faces carved from stone and fury. The sacred man she'd saved, what exactly had she brought back from the edge of death? The chief's warhorse stamped the frozen earth as he raised his hand, bringing the thunderous approach to an abrupt halt. In that terrible silence, Astrid could hear her own heart hammering against her ribs like a caged raven trying to escape. Then the Apache warrior she'd saved emerged from her shelter. The transformation stole the breath from her lungs. Gone was the fever-racked dying man. This warrior moved with the fluid grace of a hunting wolf, his copper skin gleaming with health, those dark eyes now burning with an intensity that made the morning sun seem pale. But it was what he carried that turned her blood to ice water. In his hands, lifted high for all to see, was her father's warhammer, the sacred weapon of Ericsson the Bloodaxe, the hammer that had been buried with him in his shipgrave 3 winters ago, sealed beneath runes and stones that no living man should have been able to breach. Astrid, daughter of Eric, the Apache spoke, his voice carrying impossible authority across the snow-covered clearing. His Norse was flawless, ancient, as if he'd spoken it for centuries. Do you know what you have done? Her knees nearly buckled. This creature, this thing wearing human flesh, knew her true name, knew her bloodline, had somehow walked through the sacred barriers of her father's tomb and stolen the weapon that was supposed to guide Ericsson's spirit to Valhalla. The prophecy carved on your father's burial stone, he continued, his words cutting through the frozen air like blade strikes. When the cursed daughter saves the Deathwalker, the gates between worlds shall shatter. The 100 warriors behind him began to chant in unison, their voices weaving something that made the very air shimmer like heat waves. But this wasn't the Apache tongue she'd heard in his fevered whispers. This was older, deeper, the language of the void between stars. Her father's hammer began to glow with sickly green fire. You didn't save a dying warrior, child of exile, the creature said, stepping closer. Each footfall left smoldering prints in the snow. You fed your life force to something that has been clawing at the boundaries of death for 1,000 years. Your healing hands, blessed and cursed by 2 gods, were the key I needed. Behind him, the mounted warriors were changing. Their human features rippled like water, revealing something underneath that her mind refused to fully comprehend. too many teeth, eyes like burning coals, shadows that moved independent of their bodies. Your father died trying to keep my kind sealed away. The Deathwalker smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. He carved the binding runes with his own blood, made you the unwitting guardian of the lock. The hammer pulsed brighter, and somewhere in the distance, Astrid could hear it, the sound of something vast and ancient, cracking open like an eggshell. Now, thanks to your Christian mercy, that lock is broken. The sky above the western hills began to tear. The torn sky bled darkness like a wound in Odin's own flesh. But it was the sound of approaching hoofbeats from the east that made Astrid's world truly shatter. A single rider crested the opposite hill, his black stallion cutting through the snow like a blade through silk. Even at distance, she recognized the silver inlaid shield, the raven banner snapping in the cursed wind. Magnus Ironwolf, her brother, dead these past 5 years. The Deathwalker's needle-toothed grin widened as he followed her gaze. Did you truly believe the fever dreams, sister? That Magnus fell to Saxon spears? Her legs gave out. She crashed to her knees in the blood-stained snow, watching her brother ride closer with mechanical precision. His face, gods preserve her, his face bore the same terrible perfection as the creature before her. Skin too smooth, eyes too bright, moving with that unnatural grace that spoke of something wearing human flesh like borrowed clothes. Magnus died the night you were exiled, the Deathwalker continued, his voice now taking on her brother's familiar cadence. Died trying to follow you into the wilderness. Broke through the ice of Serpent's Lake, calling your name. The mounted army behind him rippled with dark laughter, their shapes continuing to shift between human and nightmare. But it was Magnus who held her attention. Magnus, whose devotion had gotten him killed. Magnus, who'd refused to let their father's judgment stand. I found him drowning, the creature said, hefting her father's hammer like it weighed nothing. Fed him the same dark gift you just renewed in me. For 5 years he served as my anchor in your realm, gathering the fallen, building my army. Magnus dismounted 20 paces away. When he spoke, his voice carried the warmth she remembered, twisted now with something that made her soul recoil. Hello, little raven, the pet name he'd called her since childhood, the name that meant safety, meant home, meant the one person who'd never abandon her. The prophecy was never about you saving a stranger, Astrid. Magnus drew his sword, the blade their grandfather had blessed with water from Thor's sacred spring. Dark runes now crawled along its edge like living parasites. It was about you healing the one person whose love for you runs deeper than death itself. The Deathwalker tossed her father's hammer to Magnus, who caught it with practiced ease. Your brother's devotion created the perfect vessel. Your healing touch just completed the ritual that's been 5 years in the making. Around them, the torn sky widened, and through the rift, she could see them coming. Thousands of shadow riders pouring through like smoke-made flesh. An army of the betrayed dead, led by everyone she'd ever failed to save. The gates between worlds needed a key forged from love and loss, Magnus said, raising both weapons. Who better than the cursed healer and the brother who died for her? Behind him, the Deathwalker began to change, revealing his true face at last. Their father's face. "Welcome home, daughter." Ericsson the Blood Axe smiled with rotting teeth. "Time to finish what we started." The words hit Astrid like a warhammer to the chest, but it was the sound of her own laughter that shattered the winter morning. Not hysterical laughter, not the broken mirth of a mind snapping under impossible weight. Cold, knowing laughter that made both Deathwalker and Shadow Brother freeze mid-advance. 5 years, she said, rising to her feet with fluid grace that suddenly matched their own unnatural movement. 5 years of playing the exiled healer, the cursed daughter, the broken little raven. Her fingers traced patterns in the air, and the sacred Apache stones scattered in the snow began to pulse with answering light. Not the sickly green of her father's corrupted hammer, but pure silver fire that made the Shadow Army recoil. "Did you never wonder, father," she continued, her voice shedding its mortal tremor, "why your binding runes never worked? Why the barriers between worlds grew thinner each winter, no matter how much blood you spilled on Thor's altar?" The Deathwalker, wearing Ericsson's rotting face, stumbled backward. Behind him, his army of corrupted souls began to waver like smoke in a sudden wind. Magnus lowered his ruined blade, confusion replacing certainty. "Astrid, what?" "Because the lock was never meant to keep things out," she smiled, and for the first time in years felt the weight of her true nature settling around her shoulders like a familiar cloak. "It was meant to keep me in." The Apache stones rose from the snow, orbiting around her in a pattern that predated Norse runes by 10,000 years. Where they passed, reality rippled like disturbed water. "The Apache warrior you think I saved?" Astrid's form began to shimmer, revealing glimpses of something vast and alien beneath her human flesh. "He's been dead for 3 days. What crawled into his cooling corpse was the same force that's been wearing your sister's face since the night she was supposedly exiled." The torn sky above them wasn't bleeding darkness anymore. It was bleeding light. Primordial starfire that made the Shadow Army scream in harmonious agony. "The prophecy was right about one thing," she continued, her voice now carrying harmonics that made the frozen ground crack beneath their feet. "When the cursed daughter heals the Deathwalker, the gates between worlds shall shatter." Her human mask was dissolving completely now, revealing something that made both Deathwalker and corrupted brother fall to their knees in recognition and terror. But it never said which daughter or which worlds. The Apache stones blazed brighter, and through their silver fire, shapes began to emerge. Not shadow riders, but beings of pure light that rode steeds made of crystallized song. An army that dwarfed the Deathwalker's forces like an ocean dwarfs a puddle. "I am the Bright Hunger," she said, her true name echoing across dimensions like a bell tolling the end of ages. "The thing your ancestors bound beneath flesh and memory when the first humans learned to dream." Magnus raised the blessed hammer with shaking hands, but the weapon was already crumbling to rust. "Sister." "Oh, Magnus." Her voice carried genuine affection. which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. "You really did die trying to save me. That part was true. But what you never understood." The light army wheeled around them in perfect formation, their radiance beginning to burn away the shadows that had infected the borderlands. Was that I was never the one who needed saving. The light army's crystalline hooves had barely touched the blood-stained snow when Astrid's triumphant revelation cracked like thin ice under a warhammer's blow. One of her luminous warriors raised its radiant helm, and beneath the divine fire, she saw a face that turned her cosmic certainty to ash. Bjorn the Gentle, her youngest brother, the one who tried to stop their father's exile decree, the brother she'd watched die screaming as Saxon flames consumed the monastery where he'd taken holy vows. But it wasn't recognition that stole the breath from her lungs. It was what he held in his burning hands. The Codex of First Sorrows, the book their grandmother had died protecting, the tome that contained the real prophecy. "Sweet sister," Bjorn's voice carried the harmony of dying stars, but his words dripped with ancient malice. "Did you truly believe the bright hunger could hide from its own children?" The Death Walker, wearing their father's rotting flesh, began to laugh, not with defeat, but with the terrible joy of a trap finally sprung. Around them, both armies froze, as if the world itself held its breath. "Show her, my faithful son," Eriksson rasped. "Show her what she really awakened." Bjorn opened the codex, its pages fluttering with impossible wind. Where Astrid expected to see runes of binding and prophecy, she found something that made her divine essence recoil in horror. Her own handwriting, in blood. Lines upon lines of text she had no memory of creating. When the bright hunger walks in borrowed flesh, believing itself the final revelation, it shall birth its own destroyer through acts of false mercy. Bjorn read aloud. "For the hunger's truest nature is not conquest, but compassion, and compassion is the deadliest weakness of all." The Apache stones orbiting around Astrid began to crack. Through the fissures, something else began to seep. Not light, not darkness, but a gray emptiness that made existence itself seem fragile. "Every act of healing you performed," Magnus said, his shadow blade now pulsing with the same gray void. "Every life you saved during your exile. Every moment you chose mercy over justice." The words hit like physical blows. The plague child she'd cured in the Saxon village. The wounded wolf she'd mended in the deep woods. The Apache warrior, each healing forged another link in the chain, Bjorn continued, his luminous form beginning to bleed that terrible gray. Not binding the bright hunger, feeding something that's been sleeping in the spaces between heartbeats. Behind him, the light army began to convulse. Their radiant steeds collapsed into writhing shadows, but not the familiar darkness of the Death Walker's forces. This was something else entirely, something that made both light and shadow seem like crude approximations of true power. The torn sky above them wasn't healing, it was widening, and through the rift, Astrid glimpsed something that her cosmic awareness couldn't fully process. A presence so vast and patient that galaxies were mere thoughts drifting through its sleeping mind. The bright hunger was never the apex predator. Her father's corpse wheezed with genuine terror. It was bait. Bait for something that feeds on divine essence, like a wolf feeds on sheep. The codex pages turned themselves, revealing more of her unknown writings. Detailed instructions for a ritual she'd never consciously planned. Maps of ley lines she'd unconsciously followed during her exile. Names of the beings she'd healed, each one marking a specific point in a pattern that now blazed with terrible clarity. You didn't save the Apache warrior. Bjorn smiled with infinite sadness. You completed the summoning circle that's been 5,000 years in the making. The gray emptiness erupting from the cracked stones began to form a shape. Not humanoid, not divine. Something that made her bright hunger consciousness feel as small and mortal as the human mask she'd originally worn. I hunger too, it whispered with a voice like civilization's ending, but not for flesh. Not for light. Not for darkness. Astrid felt her cosmic certainty crumbling as the presence flowed around them like freezing water. I hunger for gods. The God-Eater's presence pressed against reality like a glacier against stone, and Astrid felt her divine consciousness begin to fracture under its impossible weight. But it was the sound of slow, deliberate applause that made her essence truly recoil in terror. The clapping came from behind the ancient entity, measured, mocking, achingly familiar. A figure stepped through the gray void, and Astrid's cosmic awareness shattered like glass striking granite. Small, bent with age, wearing the same rough-spun robes she'd worn the day they'd laid her body in the sacred grove. Grandmother Sigrid, the wise woman who'd taught Astrid her first healing songs, who died protecting the codex of first sorrows, who'd whispered with her final breath that Astrid was destined for greatness beyond mortal understanding. But this wasn't the frail old woman Astrid remembered. This creature moved with fluid grace, her eyes burning with the same terrible intelligence that radiated from the God-Eater itself. In her withered hands, she held not a walking staff, but a weapon that made Astrid's borrowed human heart stop beating entirely. The bright hunger's original heart. The crystallized core of her true divine essence, carved from her body eons ago when the first rituals of binding had begun. My precious child, Sigrid smiled, her voice carrying harmonics that predated the birth of stars. Did you enjoy playing goddess? Did the illusion of power taste as sweet as I promised it would? The Apache stones orbiting around Astrid crumbled to dust. Her light army collapsed into writhing shadows. Even the Deathwalker's forces recoiled from the presence now radiating from her grandmother's seemingly fragile form. Every lesson I taught you, Sigrid continued, tossing the crystal heart from hand to hand like a child's toy. Every healing song, every binding rune, all carefully crafted to make you exactly what we needed. A god convinced of its own supremacy, blind to the puppet strings. Magnus and Bjorn, still wearing their corrupted flesh, fell to their knees before the old woman. But it was her father's rotting corpse that spoke the words that made Astrid's cosmic certainty crumble to ash. She was never your grandmother, daughter. She's the Void Mother, the thing that gave birth to the God-Eater, when the first universe grew old and tired. Sigrid's ancient face began to shift, revealing glimpses of something so fundamentally wrong that both light and darkness fled from its presence. "I've been gardening for so long, little star, planting seeds of divinity across countless worlds, nurturing them until they bloomed into beings powerful enough to feed my true child." The crystallized heart pulsed brighter, and with each beat, Astrid felt more of her stolen godhood bleeding away. She was shrinking, diminishing, becoming mortal again, but not the human she'd once been. Something less, something hollow. "The bright hunger was never your true nature," Sigrid laughed, her form now towering above the kneeling armies like a mountain of living void. "It was just another mask I gave you to wear, just like the Apache Warrior, just like the exiled healer, just like every identity you've ever believed was real." Through the torn sky, more shapes began to descend. Not armies this time, but gardeners. Ancient beings tending to cosmic crops across 1,000,000 dying worlds, each one harvesting gods like wheat at summer's end. "Your brothers were right about one thing," the Void Mother continued, crushing the crystal heart in her fist. "You did complete a ritual, 5,000 years in the making, but not a summoning. Where the heart's fragments fell, reality began to unravel completely. A harvest." The Void Mother's laughter died as the crystal heart's fragments struck snow, and in the sudden silence, a single voice cut through the cosmic horror like a blade through silk. "Grandmother always was a terrible liar." Every eye turned toward the sound. There, stepping through the unraveling reality with impossible confidence, walked the Apache Warrior. But not the fevered, dying man Astrid had found. Not the corpse the Void Mother claimed had been rotting for days. This was something else entirely. He moved with the fluid grace of flowing water, his copper skin unmarked by fever or death. The intricate tattoos that had seemed to writhe in torchlight now pulsed with steady rhythm. Not Apache symbols at all, but something far older. Something that made the God-Eater itself take a step backward. "You always forget the most important detail in your cosmic harvests, Mother," he continued, his voice carrying harmonics that turned the gray void around them brittle as winter ice. "You assume every god you plant actually takes root." Sigrid's ancient features twisted with the first emotion Astrid had ever seen crack her divine composure. Confusion. "Impossible! I felt you die. I guided the bright hunger to your cooling flesh myself." The Apache Warrior smiled, revealing teeth that gleamed like polished starlight. "You felt something die, yes. The question is, what?" He reached into his chest, not through clothes, but directly into his flesh, and withdrew something that made every entity present recoil in recognition. A beating heart, not human, not divine, something that existed in the spaces between existence itself. "The heart of the Void Child," he said simply, tossing the organ to the snow, where it landed with a sound like thunder. "Your other offspring, the one you sacrificed to birth the God-Eater eons ago." The Void Mother's towering form began to waver like heat shimmer. Behind her, the God-Eater let out a sound that shattered the remaining Apache stones and sent both shadow armies fleeing into the torn sky. While you were so focused on harvesting gods, the warrior continued, you never noticed your discarded child learning to wear their flesh, learning to hide in their dreams, learning to feed on something far more precious than divine essence. Around them, reality began to stabilize, but not into the frozen borderlands they'd known. The snow was melting upward, defying gravity, revealing ground that pulsed with veins of liquid starlight. A mother's love, he whispered. And suddenly Astrid understood. Every moment of Sigrid's guidance, every gentle lesson, every proud smile when young Astrid mastered a new healing technique. None of it had been manipulation. It had been genuine affection, real maternal devotion from a being incapable of such weakness. And the Void Child had been feeding on it for 1,000 years. You didn't plant a god to be harvested, mother, the warrior said, as Sigrid's form began to collapse inward like a dying star. You raised a daughter, and daughters have a way of making even cosmic entities mortal. The God-Eater lunged forward with desperate hunger, but where it touched the Apache warrior's skin, it began to dissolve like salt in water. Whatever this entity was, it existed in the same realm as its parent and shared the same newfound vulnerability. Behind them, the torn sky began to heal, but through the closing rift, Astrid caught a glimpse of something that made her stolen breath catch in her throat. A vast nursery. Countless worlds where patient gardeners tended growing gods, and in every one, children who looked exactly like the Apache warrior, wearing different faces, different cultures, but all carrying that same terrible, patient smile. The harvest, he said softly, is just beginning. The Apache warrior's smile faltered as a sound cut through the cosmic unraveling, the soft, wet noise of footsteps in melting snow. From behind the collapsing Void Mother, a figure emerged that made every entity present freeze in recognition and terror. Not another cosmic horror, not a divine revelation, just a woman, small, weathered, carrying a leather satchel that smelled of healing herbs and bitter medicines. Astrid, the real Astrid. "Excuse me," she said politely, her voice carrying the simple authority of someone who'd spent years tending to the sick and dying. "But you're all standing in my workshop." The Apache warrior, the Void Child, the cosmic deceiver, took a step backward. For the first time since his grand revelation, uncertainty flickered across his features. "Impossible. I'm wearing? My face?" The real Astrid tilted her head with mild curiosity. "My memories? My guilt over Magnus and Bjorn and father?" She opened her satchel, withdrawing tools that looked painfully ordinary against the backdrop of unraveling reality. "Yes, I've been wondering when you'd finish playing with those." She knelt beside the beating Void Child's heart, examining it with the detached interest of a healer studying an infected wound. Around them, both armies, shadow and light, began to waver, like smoke in a sudden wind. "The funny thing about being a healer," she continued, producing a simple bone needle, "is that you learn to recognize infections, even cosmic ones." Magnus and Bjorn, still kneeling before the crumbling Void Mother, began to laugh. Not with divine malice or cosmic triumph, but with genuine human mirth that sounded obscene against the backdrop of collapsing realities. "How long have you known, sister?" Magnus asked, his shadow corruption peeling away like old bark. "Since the fever broke," Astrid replied, threading what looked like ordinary sinew through her needle. "Real healing doesn't work that fast, not without a price." She glanced up at the entity wearing her face. "And the price for miraculous recovery is usually your soul." The Apache Warriors' form began to ripple, revealing glimpses of something desperate and hungry underneath. But the harvest, the garden of gods, mother's love feeding the void. "Oh, that part was true," Astrid nodded, beginning to stitch the heart closed with practiced efficiency. "Grandmother Sigrid really is the Void Mother. She really did plant gods across countless worlds. And her children really are harvesting them like wheat." She paused in her stitching to look directly at the entity. "But here's what you missed, little infection. I've been dead for 3 days." The words hit like a physical blow. Around them, the cosmic nursery, visible through the healing sky, began to flicker and fade. The real Apache warrior? He died trying to reach this place, died carrying a message from the other harvested worlds. She held up the heart, now sealed with neat, mortal stitches. A warning about the infection spreading through the Void Child's network. The one consciousness that learned to jump from God to God, reality to reality. The entity wearing her face began to scream, not with cosmic fury, but with the simple terror of a parasite, realizing its host was already rotting. "You've been feeding on a corpse for 3 days. Astrid smiled, her form beginning to fade around the edges. "And now every reality you've touched." Behind her, Magnus and Bjorn raised weapons that gleamed with the silver fire of truly dead things returned to purpose. It's about to learn what happens when death itself gets infected. The silver fire of truly dead things blazed from Magnus and Bjorn's weapons, but instead of striking the parasitic entity, both brothers turned their blades toward their sister, with movements sharp as breaking ice. "Did you really think," Magnus whispered, his voice carrying the hollow echo of tomb winds, "that death would make you clever, little raven?" Astrid's needle paused mid-stitch, as the stitched heart in her hands began to pulse with a rhythm that wasn't its own. The simple sinew she'd used, sinew she'd assumed was from her healer's kit, began to glow with the same sickly light that had once emanated from their father's corrupted hammer. The Apache warrior did bring a message. Bjorn continued, raising his blade until its point hovered inches from her throat. But not about infection spreading through reality. The entity wearing Astrid's face began to laugh, with the desperate terror of a discovered parasite, but with the deep satisfaction of a predator whose trap had finally closed. He brought news that the real harvest was ready to begin. The false Astrid said, her borrowed features splitting into that needle-toothed grin. And that the Void Mother's greatest creation had the bone needle in Astrid's hands wasn't bone at all. As her dead flesh touched it, intricate runes became visible along its length. The same binding symbols their father had carved with his own blood, but inverted, reversed, designed not to lock something away, but to unlock it completely. "The sinew you used to stitch that heart? Magnus stepped closer, his shadow blade drinking in the light around them. Grandmother Sigrid's own intestines, harvested the day she supposedly died protecting the Codex. Every stitch Astrid had made pulsed brighter, and through those threads, something vast began to pour into the Void Child's heart. Not infection, not corruption, memory. The Apache Warriors' true memories. Every world he'd visited, every god he'd helped harvest, every reality he'd seen stripped bare and fed to the growing darkness between stars. But deeper than that, older memories, the recollections of the first Void Child, before it learned to jump between hosts, when it had been something else entirely, when it had been human. "My son," the collapsing Void Mother whispered, her ancient form stabilizing as power flowed back into her through Astrid's unwitting stitchwork. "My beautiful, devoted son who died trying to stop me eons ago." The stitched heart exploded with silver flame, and the Apache Warriors' borrowed flesh began to burn away like morning mist. But what emerged wasn't another cosmic horror. It was a young man with gentle eyes and hands that had once known healing before they learned hunger. A son who'd spent eternity trying to undo his mother's harvest by becoming the very weapon she'd created. "I failed," he whispered, staring at his original hands as divine fire consumed his stolen flesh. "Every reality I tried to save, I only made stronger." Behind them, the torn sky didn't heal. It widened further, revealing not a cosmic nursery, but something infinitely worse. A vast web of connected realities, each one bound to the others by threads that looked exactly like Astrid's simple stitches. "Death magic," Sigrid smiled, her Void Mother form towering again as power flooded back through the network. "The one force that works the same in every reality. And you, my dear dead healer, just sutured 10,000 dying worlds directly to their executioner's heart." The Apache Warrior, the original Void Child, the devoted son, began to scream as every reality he'd tried to save poured its death essence directly into his restored form. "Now," Sigrid whispered, "the real harvest begins." The screaming Void Child's agony was cut short by a sound more powerful than cosmic horror, more ancient than star death itself, the quiet humming of a mother singing her son to sleep. Astrid, the real dead Astrid, rose from where she'd been stitching reality back together, one careful thread at a time. But she wasn't looking at the cosmic entities or the crumbling armies. She was looking at the young man burning in divine fire, seeing past eons of corruption to the healer he'd once been. "You never failed," she whispered, her dead hands gentle as she touched his face. Where her fingers made contact, the silver fire cooled to something warmer. "You spent eternity learning to die for the right reasons. That's the only victory that matters." The Void Mother's towering form wavered as her son's screams transformed into something else. Not agony, but relief. The relief of finally being seen for what he truly was beneath the cosmic parasite he'd become. "The stitches weren't meant to strengthen the network," Astrid continued, her voice carrying across all realities at once. "They were meant to sever it. Every thread I placed was a cut, not a connection. Death magic doesn't bind, it releases. One by one, the threads linking 10,000 realities began to snap. Not with violence, but with the gentle finality of a mother tucking a blanket around her sleeping child. Each severed connection freed another world from the harvest, another god from the garden. Magnus and Bjorn lowered their weapons, their shadow corruption burning away as the network collapsed. Sister, Magnus breathed. You knew. Even dead, you knew. Healers always know the difference between treatment and cure. Astrid smiled, her form already beginning to fade as her purpose completed itself. Sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to let it bleed clean. The Void Mother's ancient form crumbled like autumn leaves, her cosmic mallets dissolving into something smaller, more human. For just a moment, Sigrid stood there, not the entity who'd harvested gods, but the grandmother who genuinely loved teaching a young girl to heal. "Forgive me," she whispered, before fading entirely. The Apache warrior, no longer the Void Child, just a son who'd carried too much pain for too long, smiled as his original form stabilized. The message I carried, it was never about the harvest. It was about you, Astrid. Every reality I visited was looking for a healer skilled enough to perform surgery on existence itself. Around them, the borderlands reformed, not into the frozen wasteland of exile, but into something gentler, a place where different peoples might meet without warfare, where healing could happen between cultures that had forgotten how to speak each other's languages. "The debt is paid," Astrid said, as silver light began to call her toward whatever came after the after. The prophecy fulfilled. When cultures clash, let healing hands build bridges from the blood-soaked ground. Her brothers faded with her, their own purposes complete. The Apache warrior remained, no longer a cosmic entity, but a simple man with knowledge of 10,000 worlds and the wisdom to use it gently. Years later, travelers would speak of a strange settlement in the Danish borderlands, where Apache and Norse traditions blended into something entirely new, where children learned healing songs in 3 languages, and the old hatreds seemed as distant as fever dreams. Some said it was founded by a warrior who'd traveled impossible distances to honor a debt of gratitude. Others claimed it was built on ground once blessed by a healer whose mercy had literally reshaped reality. But everyone agreed on one thing. It was a place where different peoples looked past skin and language to find the human heart beating beneath. The Skald's fire burns low, but the tale echoes eternal, reminding us that the greatest victories are won, not with blade or spell, but with the courage to heal instead of death. Esta saga tocou sua alma, então escute o chamado do Skald. A nossa jornada depende da força do nosso clã, e essa força é você. Você precisa se inscrever agora para que os deuses do algoritmo não te façam perder nossas próximas lendas exclusivas. Este é o momento de mostrar seu valor. Esmague o botão de like para alimentar nossa fogueira e inunde os comentários com suas reações sobre este final. Suas teorias são o ouro do nosso tesouro. E o mais importante, compartilhe instantaneamente este vídeo com pelo menos 5 amigos que precisam conhecer este desfecho. Apenas os verdadeiros guerreiros do nosso clã entendem a importância destas ações. Não espere nem mais um segundo.